As if I needed any more proof that life is fundamentally unfair, I read the bios of our two authors. And first, Tara Conklin. Tara has previously published her short fiction. And then she was before that a Yale undergrad, and she went to N.Y.U. Law School. Then she worked as a litigator in New York and London in the offices of a big law firm, and obviously had the guts and creativity and good sense to get the hell out of that life and to start another one, which has led her to this stage. But in addition to all of that, she dealt cards in Costa Rica. She planned press events in Moscow. She taught English in Madrid. And she waited tables in Montana. James Bond would be envious of Tara Conklin. And Jeanine Cummins. She's the author of a true crime memoir, A Rip in Heaven, and the much acclaimed first novel, The Outside Boy. And she's lived in such cool places as Ireland, California, New York City, and Gaithersburg, Maryland.
The jewel in my traveling crown.
Jerry Hogan, on the other hand, has lived in Maryland, which is why I think that life is fundamentally unfair. The second reason that life is fundamentally unfair is that both of these people who are with me on the stage are fabulous writers who have written beautiful and ingeniously plotted novels, both of which have parallel narratives, hence the name of this presentation. One set in the modern day, and the other set in the mid-19th century. I've loved parallel narrative novels ever since I read A.S. Byatt's Possession, one of the great novels of the 20th century, I think. And it is a novel that is set in the modern day and also in the 19th century. And what was remarkable about Possession, I think, was the symbiotic manner in which Byatt managed to tell the two stories, the way each story informed and advanced the other. Both stories, both sets of her characters, were equally compelling. But in the years since Possession, I've read a number of novels with these similar dual narratives that have, in my view, failed because one of the narratives, usually the modern half, is simply flat by comparison to the historical half. And in some of these novels, it seemed plain that the writer really wants to tell the historical piece, which is usually set in a vivid and often tragic period, while the modern protagonist is just a device for revealing the tragedy. But I'm here to report that neither of these novels, neither Tara's nor Jeanine's, falls into that category of unbalanced dual narratives. In my view, the triumph of both of these works is that the parallel stories feature an interesting modern-day protagonist and also an interesting historical protagonist. Tara's book, The House Girl, describes a very few dramatic days in the life of an abused 17-year-old slave named Josephine, who also happened to be a brilliant painter. And her modern-day protagonist is an overworked associate at a New York City law firm, Lena Sparrow, which is a great name, by the way. What a great name, Lena Sparrow. And naturally, the Lena chapters deal with events less dire and less life-threatening, yet I never found myself skipping over the modern parts to get back to Josephine. And the same was true with Jeanine's novel. It involved the Irish potato famine of the 1840s, and from the very first chapter, she makes us feel that sense of dread, that foreboding about hunger and death that was felt by millions of people in Ireland back in the 1840s. And yet, when she switches to the young mother in modern-day Queens, who's grappling with modern-day frustrations such as depression over the loss of her old life and the fears that she's not going to be a good mom, I wanted to read every last sentence. So based on the previous disappointments and my initial fears, these were all quickly allayed by the fabulous writing of both of these authors. And I ended up caring about all of the characters. And that's something that's not easy to pull off in a parallel narrative. So congratulations to both these writers on writing great books that deserve a lot of praise and attention. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to these two great young writers to ask each other, well, first of all, to read short sections of their books and to ask each other some questions about how they went about writing what seemed to me structurally similar novels. So take it away.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry. That was a great introduction. And thank you all for being here on kind of a chilly day. I'm freezing up here, so if my teeth start to chatter, I apologize in advance. I'm just going to read sort of the opening couple pages of the novel, The House Girl. It opens with Josephine. Lyndhurst, Virginia, 1852. Mr. hit Josephine with the palm of his hand across her left cheek, and it was then she knew she would run. She heard the whistle of the blow, felt the sting of skin against skin. Her head spun, and she was looking back over her right shoulder, down to the fields where the few men Mr. had left were working the tobacco. The leaves hung heavy and low on the stalk, ready for picking. She saw a man's bare back and the new hired man, Nathan, staring up at the house, leaning on a rake. The air tasted sweet, the honeysuckle crawling up the porch railings, thick now with flour, and the sweetness mixed with the blood in her mouth. The blow came without warning, no reason that Josephine could say. She had been sweeping the front porch as she always did first thing, clearing off the dust and leaves blown up by the night wind. A snail had marked a trail across the dew-wet wood of the porch floor and rested its brown shell between the two porch rockers. Josephine had caught that snail with a sharp swoop of the broom, sent it flying out into the yard, and then she heard Mister's voice behind her, coming from inside the house. He said something she could not make out. It was not a question. There was no uplift in tone, nor was it said in anger. His voice was measured, it had seemed to Josephine then, before he hit her. Not urgent, not hurried. She stopped her sweeping, turned around, looked to the house, and he walked out the wide front door, a proud front door, Mrs. Lou always liked to say, and that's when his hand rose up. She saw his right arm bend and his lips part just slightly, not to open, but just the barest hint of dark space between them. And then his palm, the force of it against her cheek, and the broom dropping from her fingers, the clatter as it fell. Something shifted in Josephine then, a gathering of disparate desires that before had been scattered. She could not name them all, there were so many, but most were simple things. To eat a meal when hunger struck her, to smile without thinking, to wear a dress that fit her well, to place upon the wall a picture she had made, to love a person of her choosing. These distilled now perfectly here on this September morning, her hunger for breakfast sharp in her belly, the sun pink and resplendent in the sky. Today was the last day. There would be no others. As Josephine turned her head back around to face Mister, a warbler called from down toward the river, its sweet, 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 clear as the brightening day. Mister said, "Look after your missus. The doctor coming today, don't you forget." He stepped off the porch into the dirt of the front path and looked up at her, his dark beard dusty from the fields, his eyes shadowed. She nodded, her cheek on fire. Mister walked in long steps down the sloping back hill of the yard, across the raw, furrowed rows they had had no seed to plant. Josephine watched him go. She wanted to bring her hand to her cheek, but she didn't. She spat a red streak across the weathered floorboards, rubbed at it with her bare right foot, and then picked up her basket, stepped down off the porch, around the side of the house. There was a lightness in her, a giddiness almost. She walked down the slight slope, the grass cool under her feet, the sun a little higher now, the low mist burning off. Run. The word echoed thunderous in her ear and filled her head like a physical liquid thing. Run. That's where I'm going to stop.
So beautiful.
And now I will turn it over to Jeanine.
Okay, thank you. I'd love to follow that. For me. I just want to start by saying thank you to the city of Gaithersburg for hosting this amazing event. This is my third book. I've been to literary festivals all over the country, and to come back to my hometown and see such a vibrant, incredible event like this happening in Gaithersburg is very exciting. So I plan to be here every single year that they will have me. So I was trying to think about which section to read for you guys, whether I would read something from the historical section or the contemporary, and then I remembered that we promised you adult content. So
I didn't notice that. Yeah.
The historical sections are obviously told in a very different, more lyrical voice, and there's no cursing, so I'm going to read from the contemporary section. So my contemporary character is a young mother living in Queens, New York, who is very overwhelmed by the birth of her first child. And she's feeling fairly like a huge sloppy failure. And her husband has gone back to work, and so this is a scene, shortly after her husband goes back to work. Leo comes home early because it's Tuesday, and the restaurant is quiet, but I don't hear him come in because Emma is screaming. She's been crying since 12 minutes past 5 o'clock, and it is now 7:38. When I see Leo's face appear, I am so happy I could weep. So I do. I weep. And he sweeps heroically into the room and scoops that baby out of my arms, and he's talking to me, but I couldn't tell you what he's saying, not for all the money in the world. And I look down at myself now that Emma is safe in her father's arms, and I notice how I'm shaking. And my shapeless green shirt is all wet, and I don't even know what that liquid is. Snot, tears, saliva, milk. I don't even know who that liquid came from. I go through the kitchen and open the door into our little mudroom, and I go through that mudroom with its strange sloped ceiling and low-hanging light fixture, and I open the back door of our house. I don't flip on the back porch light because I don't want to attract mosquitoes. I step outside and I try to close the door firmly behind me, but I end up slamming it instead. I sit on the top step and plant my elbows onto my knees. Everything is shaking. How long have I been shaking? It is twilight in my back garden now, and the painted white brick of the apartment building next door is glowing a soft purple. Leo and I haven't managed to clear out this garden yet. It's overgrown and wild beyond the square patch of concrete where our little table and chairs sit, our deluxe barbecue. That machine was one of the only things that excited Leo about moving to Queens. A real, honest-to-God, macho, sleek, oversized suburban barbecue. I stare at it now, blurry because I'm still crying. My head is pounding. How could I have been so wrong about all this? About how it was going to be living here, raising a family. A lone cricket creaks pathetically somewhere in that tangle of mad foliage. I tell it to shut the fuck up. Then, a giggle. I look up at one of the windows in the white painted brick, and a little face is shining down at me. I heard you say a bad word. He's a kid, maybe 5 or 6, in one of the second floor apartments. Yeah, sorry, I say. I liked it. This kid is the best thing that's happened to me all day. Maybe Emma will be like this one day, bright and smiley and not screaming. I'm supposed to be asleeping, the kid tells me. My name is Franklin. I nod. I'm Magella. He stares down at me for a while longer, and we don't talk, but I feel like he's the best friend I've ever had. Good night, he says after a few more minutes. Good night, I tell him. And I hear him yawn as he drops away from the screen. I don't want to go back inside in case Emma is still crying, but the mosquitoes are starting to swarm, so I stand up and take some deep breaths before heading back in. It's quiet except for the sound of Leo's voice. I make my way to the office, and Leo looks up at me. Hang on, he says to someone on the computer, and then to me, she's asleep. Are you fucking kidding me? I think, but do not say. To Leo, I say, wow. Yeah, I'm just talking to Jeff on Skype. Hi, Magella. I hear the voice of Leo's brother coming from our computer speakers. Hi, Jeff, I say without stepping in front of the camera, because I am such a disgusting mess. I cannot possibly appear on Skype without a shower, a whiskey, and hundreds of dollars worth of spa treatments. I'll be out in a minute. I brought you a bottle of wine in the fridge, Leo says. For this, I will give him sex. Thank you, I say, and I slip out of the room and back toward the kitchen. I can still hear them chatting as I work the corkscrew into the bottle top. So it's totally amazing being parents, right? Jeff says. He and his wife have been thinking about starting a family, too. They live in Colorado. Yeah, it's awesome, Leo says. But has it just completely turned your whole world upside down, or what? Jeff asks. No, not really, Leo says. Not really? I put the bottle down so I won't drop it. I step closer to the door to eavesdrop. You know, life is pretty much the same. Now we just have a baby, Leo is saying. What, is he insane? Or maybe he's just lying because he wants parenthood to seem fantastic so that Jeff and his wife will hurry up and do it too. Maybe he wants to trick them. But I hear him saying that the biggest change of all really is living in Queens, and I just don't feel like you could make this shit up. I step back to my wine bottle and attack the cork with renewed vigor. It pops, and I take a large gulp straight from the bottle before finding myself a glass. I install myself on the couch, and after a few minutes, Leo joins me. You're home early, I say. Just in the nick of time, he says. Yeah, you're telling me. How long was she crying, he asks. Before you came in? I don't know, 2.5, 3 hours. In fact, I know exactly how long it was because I watch the clock when she cries. It was 2 hours and 26 minutes, but I always round up when Leo asks because I need him to understand the enormity of it. I could, in fact, tell him that she had been crying for 17,000 hours, and that would feel closer to the emotional truth of the situation. Oh, that's awful, he says. I guess she wore herself out because she conked out after about 5 minutes when I came in. I grip my wine so hard that the pads of my fingers turn yellow beneath the glass. He takes it from me, has a sip, hands it back. Then he walks into the kitchen, finds himself a glass. Hey, Leo, let me ask you something. Yeah? There's nothing so beautiful as the sound of a wine bottle glugging into a glass to soothe a frazzled, exhausted mind. I close my eyes and listen to him pour. He plops down beside me on the couch. Did you mean what you said to your brother? About life being pretty much the same, except now we have a baby? Leo takes a sip of his wine and thinks it over. Yeah, I guess I did. Oh. Okay, that's it. So, thank you.
I love that 17 hours and the emotional truth of the situation. I can totally relate to that after my first baby. So I was sitting in on Jamie Attenberg and Jennifer Close's session earlier today. I don't know if any of you guys saw it. And they had this great thing going where they were just asking each other questions for, I don't know, about 15, 20 minutes. And it was just really interesting. And so we decided to totally steal their presentation idea. And because this is about parallel narratives, I thought we would start with a question about parallel narratives. Jeanine, why did you choose this structure? Because when I was telling people what I was doing kind of towards the end of the writing process, I would start to explain it, and it would take me like 20 minutes to explain the synopsis of the story, and they would just kind of look at me with a blank look and then say, why don't you want to make it easier for yourself? Because it is, I think there are a lot of very specific challenges to this kind of novel. So why did you choose this kind of structure?
It certainly makes the book harder to talk about, but I think it's always hard when somebody says to you, like, tell me about your book. And I'm like, it's 100,000 words. So now I can, like, I'm supposed to make 3 tidy little sentences so it's always difficult. And I think this makes it harder because my book is set in the Irish famine. It's also set in contemporary Queens, and it's really about the sort of universal power and grief and challenges of motherhood in all different times, both catastrophic and ordinary. And I think I happened upon this structure quite by accident. I knew that I wanted to write about the famine. And I also knew that that was an incredibly heavy topic. And it was a very daunting task, which your book is as well. The subject matter, to think that you can do justice of the staggering sufferings of those people it's a very daunting task. And so I knew that my way into the humanity of that tale was through the lens of motherhood. And I sort of understood that I needed a relief valve from those chapters when I was doing the research for this book. And I would read all about the Irish famine. It was so heavy and it was so horrific. I had nightmares for weeks. And I felt like I really needed a sense of like a moment to take a breath from that. And so my own sort of totally fictionalized account of motherhood in New York City. I was living. Whoa, that's so exciting.
Poltergeist.
Woo. Okay. So my own accounts of my own daunting tasks of motherhood started to loom up in those moments when I was taking a break from the famine sections. And that story, the story of Magella living in Queens, rose up raw within me and came out. It was the fastest thing I've ever written. And I started to recognize very quickly as I was writing those contemporary chapters, I never really knew what would become of them initially. And as I was writing them, I started seeing all the parallels and all the ways in which the two stories were related. And I think it's a very natural thing for a young mother who has her first baby, who thinks, I wasn't like a kid, like I was 32, I think, when my first daughter was born. And I had a very well-established sense of identity, I thought. And then that baby came, and she rocked everything I thought I knew about myself. And I started recognizing some, like, ugly characteristics that I thought I didn't have in me, like impatience. And I knew some mothers in my family history that were a little crazy. We all have them, right? Right, Dad? So I think it's a very natural thing for a young mother who starts to recognize these kind of scary moments in herself to go, where did this come from? Can I conquer it? And the natural thing to do is to look at the mothers who came before you and to see what you can learn from them, and to try to choose the things that you wish to inherit from the mothers who came before, and equally importantly, what you don't want to pass on into the waiting ears of your little daughters, And so this book became an exploration of all that for me. It really happened organically and accidentally, and I'm very glad that it did. And when I was reading your book, I loved The House Girl, by the way. And I was so impressed. Equally daunting subject matter, slavery. It's the sort of thing that most people, especially most, white writers, don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. And I thought Tara did it so beautifully and with such tremendous regard and respect, and really well done. One of the things that I really loved about your book and that just totally drew me in, and it was equally strong in the historic sections and the contemporary sections, was this immediate sense of textural depth to the scenes. Like, you describe everything, the smells and the minute little moments that she experiences, that Josephine experiences. And I really felt like I was there in those moments. And that's really tough to sustain when you're writing in two such different time periods. So I was wondering how that evolved for you.
Well, thank you. First, I loved your book too. We're a mutual admiration society, if you haven't noticed. Let's see, my kind of process to writing this book was very roundabout. And I started this book as a story that I was writing about a slave doctor. I came across the term slave doctor in a biography of Virginia Woolf that I was reading, and I just started thinking about that term and what that position would require, and what would drive someone who was a doctor, someone dedicated to healing, to do that, and to to basically treat people who were destined only for more and graver harm. And so I was a lawyer. This is my first book, and I used to be a lawyer, as Jerry mentioned. And I was still working as a lawyer at the time. And but I'd always been sort of a scribbler of stories, and so I just started writing a story about a slave doctor who I named Caleb Harper. And for those of you that have read the book, Caleb Harper's narrative is now the last narrative in the novel, but it was where the whole thing started for me. And I started writing, and two women appeared in the book, in his story. Josephine Bell, who is now the house girl and artist in the novel, and a white woman who works on the Underground Railroad named Dorothea Rounds. And these characters just kind of appeared, like they just showed up in Caleb's story. And I wrote Caleb's story, and then I kind of put it aside because I, had a job and a life and other things I was supposed to be doing. But I couldn't really stop thinking about these two women. And so I wanted to know more about them. So I started writing their stories. And I have always loved epistolary novels, Possession being one of my all-time favorites as well. And so I thought it'll be really fun to write a series of letters. So Dorothea Round's section in the novel is written as a series of letters, and then I started to write Josephine first in the first person, and I became really obsessed. There is no other word, with the character of Josephine Bell. And I started reading a lot of history books about the time period and slave narratives, and really trying to get inside that world, which is it's a rough world to get inside of. And so I wrote these 3 historical sections without thinking that it would be a novel. I mean, I just wrote them for myself. And I was learning about the time period, which I am from Massachusetts, and I grew up in Massachusetts, and I never really studied the antebellum South before. So it was very educational for me, and I felt I was, learning myself as I was doing the research. And then I put these historical sections to the side, and I just thought they were, I was a lawyer, and I wasn't going to do anything with them. Like the other stories that I had written were just going to sit in my computer. But I really couldn't stop thinking about them, and I really did try. You can ask my husband. He was like, "Just be a lawyer. You're happy in your law career, right?" And yeah, no, I wasn't. And and once I started really writing, I kind of realized that the thing I liked about law was the writing part and not really the law part.
I want to know what else is sitting in that computer of yours. All those forgotten stories.
Yeah. And so it wasn't, and we were talking about this last night. I really, I just felt like it was really sad to leave these people, these historical characters in the past. I just felt this sadness about just keeping them there, and I really wanted to give their stories some contemporary relevance. I wanted to make their lives and their suffering matter in a contemporary way. And that's when I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll actually try to write a novel, and maybe because I love stories that have these parallel narratives, I'll have a contemporary section. And that's when I started writing about Lena Sparrow, and who is a lawyer and is working on a slavery reparations lawsuit, and becomes, equally obsessed with Josephine Bell, and decides to find a descendant of Josephine Bell's to lead this class action lawsuit. And so for me, it was like I said, very roundabout way to get to the current structure. And each section I wrote completely separately. And then I had these four sections: the slave doctor Caleb Harper, Josephine Bell, Dorothea Rounds, who's on the Underground Railroad, and Lena Sparrow, the contemporary. And I just put them together and took them apart, and put them together and took them apart. And that process took about, maybe 9 or 10 months. And I literally at one point had everything printed out. This is like cut and paste old school, like everything on the floor with scissors and like, shifting it around in piles, and until, I finally got the format that it now is in. And it alternates pretty evenly spaced between Lena's story and Josephine's story now.
Were you ever concerned about what Jerry was mentioning about, like, I have found that most of my readers tend to be surprised that they actually like both stories equally. But some have found my contemporary character to be a little whiny, which I don't know. And I think that that's crazy. But anyway, I do worry that it's difficult when you juxtapose someone who has, look, Magella is struggling. She's living in Queens. She's postpartum depressed. She is completely out of her element. She's freaking out, right? And so she's a little whiny, all right? I'll admit she's a little whiny. But I think that the problem is when you juxtapose someone who's having a real, genuine, contemporary struggle, living in America in a pretty privileged first world existence, with someone who is facing absolute catastrophe. You're not giving them an even playing field. You're not really giving that contemporary character the leeway that she might otherwise have to sort of suck the empathy from the reader. The reader's sympathies may be more naturally drawn to that character who is living in slavery. You know.
Yeah.
Were you worried about that? How did you balance it?
I mean, I think it is a real danger is that, well, I mean, I always thought that would be a good problem to have if people are saying, well, I love this protagonist, but I'm not so crazy about that protagonist. You know, I mean, but I do think that it's a natural thing in these kinds of books that people will pick favorites. Readers will decide which one they like better. And I just thought, well, if they like one of them,
Yeah.
I'll be happy. But I think another danger, and this is going to the point about how do you compare like a life and death situation like the potato famine, like slavery in America, with the very privileged conflicts that most Americans deal with today about, you know, how do I find myself, which is sort of this Lena's central conflict, or how do I find my identity as a new mother, which is Magella's, and it isn't a level playing field. But I think the richness of these kinds of books is that, you know, it's a little bit more, the comparisons are more subtle. You know, I mean, I'm not saying, like, the book is not meant to be a literal, a literal comparison between and one reviewer actually thought that this was kind of this thrust of the book, was like the slavery of corporate America versus the slavery of the antebellum South. Yeah, thank you for laughing. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? And I was like, what? And so, but I think you run risk that the readers maybe will.
I guess
that's a risk
worth
any. But I think that the richness of these kinds of books is that you are able to kind of pick up these themes, and really universal themes that run, you know, through history and through time, and to show the the essential humanity of these characters across time, and how even, you know, a Irish woman in struggling in the potato famine, like we can understand her and empathize with her, and I think that's really the brilliance of fiction is to kind of exercise that empathy muscle, even when with individuals who are very dissimilar from you on paper. And that was really that was something that was really important to me in writing my book, was, Josephine is obviously very, very dissimilar from me, but I just really felt her character so deeply, and I am thrilled that other readers are feeling her character as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I read, is always in search of that empathy. And I think one thing that I learned in my first book was a memoir called A Rip in Heaven. And it was a memoir of a horrific, violent, true crime that happened to my family when I was 16 years old. And so writing that book and publishing that book was the hardest thing I've ever done, including having children. And so when that book was finished and I was ready to move on to writing fiction, so ready to never write nonfiction again, I was thinking that I needed to get some emotional distance from my subject matter. I needed a little bit of anonymity as the writer. So the obvious choice was to write about a 12-year-old gypsy boy in Ireland in the 1950s. And my editor was like, "You have a sales background. Like, what were you thinking? Like, But I wrote The Outside Boy, which I think I've always known as a writer that, like, I need to stop saying this because people's eyes, like, it's not like a popular commercial thing to say, but the impetus for me as a writer is always injustice. Like, I always want to take something that I see in the world that I think is unfair, and I want to address it and explore it in fiction and perhaps give the reader a new perspective on that thing. So I lived in Ireland for a long time, and I knew these travelers, and they were very poorly thought of in mainstream society in Ireland. And I thought, what is it to be a kid who grows up in that kind of culture, completely marginalized, and he's like a regular, good, nice kid, and everyone thinks he's like a goblin, because he's a traveler. And I think I quickly realized in writing fiction that it doesn't matter how you dress up your characters. Like, you can make them stormtroopers or hobbits or Irish gypsy boys, and if you're doing fiction right, it's the empathy and the humanity and the psychology of those characters, that universal humanity of those characters, that makes the book appealing and authentic for readers. And so I think that realization gave me the courage to come back to some subject matter that for me was a little bit closer to home, and these contemporary characters. But the subject matter was very daunting. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that the two books really have in common, is that it's a heavy, difficult topic to tackle. And I was wondering if you ever really thought about that, or if you kind of maybe need to put it aside while you write.
Yeah.
How did you handle that?
Well, the research was very, as I said, I did feel like it was very educational for me. But it was also very depressing. It was very sad. And at a certain point, I really just stopped reading about the time period because I was getting overwhelmed by the idea of writing about slavery, as an institution. And I just really tried to focus on telling the story of this one character, telling Josephine Bell's story. And that sort of helped me.
Yeah.
That was what helped me push through those issues and put words to paper.
Yeah.
And write.
I think my book is really similar, and I really admire writers like Colin McCann, who can take a sweep of history and write something incredibly epic and kind of zoomed out, and do it really well in a way that's very engaging. But I think personally, as a writer, the books that I'm more drawn to, like your book, the reason is because it really is one personal experience against the backdrop of something maybe incredibly dramatic and a historic moment in our nation's a historic, like, ugly moment in our nation's history. But we are experiencing it very up close and personal with your characters, and that's what I love. Mm-hmm. That's what I loved about your book.
Do you think we should open it to questions?
Yeah, maybe we should. Do you guys have...
Does anybody have any questions?
She's getting
the microphone.
I wanted to expand on that question a little bit, because I think what we know now is that culture has so much to do with psychology, that different people from different cultures really think about things differently. Mm-hmm. And I wondered, when although your historical settings are not as far from America as some might be, but they're pretty far. And your characters who are really culturally different, the gypsy boy, the house girl, did you struggle, and how did you think about how did you kind of throw yourself into that person's mind, and what did you do to try to understand how they would consider things that might be different from how the contemporary person might think
Right.
about things?
I think for me, with this novel, that's why I chose the lens of motherhood to really be the thrust of the historical sections, because I felt like motherhood was there's something so universal in the experience, so primal in the experience of being a mother, that you can really get your teeth into it, and everything else is window dressing that goes around that motherhood and what is at the core of that ferocious, primal love that you have for those children. And then I had to sort of extrapolate that to try to understand what it would be to be living in a country where there is literally no food to feed your children. There is nothing to give them. And just to try to imagine the backdrop of what that would feel like and what kind of risks you would be willing to take rather than watching your children starve day by day. The choices that historical character in the Crooked Branch faces are just tremendously horrifying. And I just try to put myself in the shoes of that person in that moment. I also did a lot of research, which caused nightmares for weeks. I mean, the stories, the most moving thing that I read, the prologue of my book is written, I think the first sentence is, "It all happened in one night." And then the prologue shows this fog rolling across the countryside of Ireland that just kills everything. And I knew that historically, scientifically, that's not how it happened. But I read a book of oral histories of the famine, and that's how people remembered it. And I thought there was something so powerful and brutal about that description that they went to bed one night and everything was fine. And they woke up in the morning and, like a year later, a quarter of the country was dead. Ugh. So, I had to, that brings me, we're back to parallel narratives, because that's why I needed that relief valve of the contemporary character.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to put yourself in that mindset. I read a lot of slave narratives. I read a lot of first-person accounts. There are published slave narratives that a lot of them were written by white abolitionists. So there's a little bit of question as to authenticity. But I read a lot of those, and I also read on the Library of Congress website. They have first-person accounts that were taken in the 1920s. Sort of the last surviving slaves giving their memories, and I read all of those, not all of them, but I read a lot of them, and so I just tried to immerse myself in those experiences, and just to think about how, what are the psychological tools that someone would use to get through a horrific experience like that. If you're living in this horrific environment, and Josephine she basically puts her emotions away. She envisions this tall chest, this chest of drawers, and she folds her emotions up and she puts them in the drawers and she closes the drawers. And that was something that I just, how would you get through your days? How would you put one foot in front of the other and take one breath and another when you would have, the horrible experiences that she suffered through? And that was something. My dad is a social worker. He's in mental health, and so anyhow, he had told me some stories that kind of inspired me to think about that as a device for her to use. But it was difficult. It was difficult to write those sections. But it was basically reading contemporary.
I also think, I just want to say, to the topic of empathy and diversity and pandering to my audience, I often, this always comes up when I meet people from Montgomery County, and whenever I was in California last week, I met some old classmates, and every time it comes up, growing up in this city, it's not just a diverse community, it is an integrated diverse community in Montgomery County. And that was something that I completely took for granted. So I left here when I was 17 years old, and I went to college in Baltimore. Such a segregated town. And I woke up one morning and was like, holy cow, there's racism in the world. I didn't know, because I grew up in this unique community where I had friends of every different race and creed, and I thought that's how the world was. And so I happened to be Irish and Puerto Rican in my background. None of my childhood friends knew that. They didn't care. I didn't know what they were. You know, we all just were. And I think there's something about growing up with that kind of innocence that broadens your empathetic scope, maybe. And then facing, when you're 18 or 19 years old, suddenly facing institutionalized racism and segregation as it exists in the world, and it startled me. And having to sort of self-identify for the first time, like, what am I? What is my racial makeup? Like, it never mattered to me before then. And I think that was a seed in me that definitely drove me to become a writer in a certain way. So. Uh-oh, my dad's standing up. Thank you for the corsage, Dad, by the way.
I know that we're almost out of time. I don't know if either of you is ready to answer this question, but Tara, what's next?
Oh.
Tink. Am I allowed to say Tink, or do I have to say
No, the
Jeanine?
cat's out of the bag. My name's Tink, actually.
What's next?
You want to...
Sure. I'm working on another novel. As I tell my agent, I'm thinking about it as I wash the dishes. Yeah, I'm working on it. It's very different from The House Girl. Although it does go back and forth in time, but it's about a family. It's about 3 sisters and their brother who dies suddenly and tragically, and it's kind of a contemporary family drama centering on these siblings. I just think sibling relationships are fascinating. I have 3 kids. I'm one of 3. And I'm just really fascinated in the sibling dynamic. So yeah, I'm excited to work on it. And it's hard to write, to focus on one book while you're promoting another book. So I'm excited to get back to it this summer and really sit down and write.
I am just beginning. I have maybe 30 pages written of a new novel about immigration. It's about a little boy, like a really, really remarkable little boy who's based on my nephew, who has a brain that is just amazing. And he is like living on the streets in Mexico, and he's all alone in the world, and this young woman meets him and falls in love with him. So it's about her trying to get him and save him and bring him to safety. And that's where we're going with it. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that we read my book, your book.
Oh.
And I didn't read it right out. And one of my book club members said, "You don't want to read it. It's so depressing."
Oh, great.
So
Don't listen to her.
I read it, and what I thought was really wonderful, and it's not really a question, was just the sense of humor that you put in there. So every once in a while, you had reason to hope and reason to laugh.
Yeah.
And I really love that about
Thank you.
style. So thank you, because I had a totally different view. And
Good.
so did most of the other.
Oh, thank God. Thank you. Like anyone, I've had trauma in my own life. I've had my own demons, and I think I have learned how to deal with them by being incredibly hilarious all the time. So I think that there's lots of room for lightness and beauty and humor in books about trauma and sadness. So thank you. Thank you. 0 minutes. Oh, I'm so sad. We're out of time. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.